fans, wherever you may be, welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers as we talk Seahawks football.
Hey, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another edition of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers here this week, like 2 weeks removed from the season, getting into our off-season programming. This week, we're taking a look at the quarterback market, including Geno Smith, but particularly if the Seahawks elect to move on from Geno moves on from the Seahawks, what's left out there? What do the Seahawks do? All that kind of stuff. Welcome in, man. Good to see you.
Yeah, that's good to see you too. So, mostly this is if a team goes crazy and pays Geno way more than he's worth, and the Seahawks are like, "Nah, we can't do that." What does Seattle do at quarterback? And that's a massive question for a team that made the playoffs and looks to be improved because of their draft position and all of that. Like they could go in and be a team that is improved going forward, but they've got a fixed quarterback if they're going to do that. And that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, last week, you and I got together and we talked about Geno's market. And you and I kind of disagreed and then kind of agreed that his market's probably around 20 million.
Yes.
And that's, just kind of where it's going to land as far as his value, mainly because there's not going to be a lot of teams that are going to pay him more than that. They're just, in order to invest in a quarterback his age, you've got to be ready to contend and just be missing a quarterback. And plus you have that thing that GMs aren't going to spend, $100 million on him, because that's their career. They're putting on the line to someone who's had one good season.
Yeah. I think you're right. Most of that I agree with. I think that the uncertainty comes in for me on how fast this deal gets done. I think the sooner it gets done, the more it favors Geno Smith. Geno's going to go to the Pro Bowl. He's got all this activity as far as some offseason awards are concerned for him. Just kind of builds his value just a little bit. Not a lot. I mean, Seattle is what they are. Geno is who he is. I do think, though, if they came out with a contract this week or next week, it could be on the higher range than we're thinking, upwards of 25 or something with a lot of guaranteed money in there and stuff. And I would be a little squeamish on that sort of a deal. I think the closer it gets to the franchise tag situation, I think the uncertainty for Geno is out there, and I think that he signs a deal. Or it goes longer than, say, the Seattle doesn't franchise him and he can't find a market out there. He comes back. I think that then really lowers everything down. So I think Seattle needs to be patient here. I think there are some options. We'll go through those today and we'll show that while Geno, I think, would be the best option forward at a certain value. If it's just not there, there's other things there that we can do.
Yeah.
All the way from, there's a little bit of a trade market. It wouldn't be the greatest situation for Seattle, but if they took a big step forward, there's a couple players out there. The free agents market is out there, including Geno, including Drew Lock, other players, and then of course the draft. So we'll get through all of it. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I was just going to say, we were like last week, we kind of said, there's probably not the market there that people think there's going to be. But I did come up with a situation that actually might produce a market for Geno Smith. And it was because I was looking into the trade market and all of that. And I came across, the contract situation and everything that's going on with Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. 26, former MVP, but he's missed a lot of time the last 2 weeks or 2 years because of injury, because of his playing style and all of that. And the team and him are not close on a number. And I mean, they're clearly a significantly better team with him. His talent and value are there, But if they don't want to go and hamstring the entire franchise for years by, having him just eat up their cap, they might choose to franchise him and trade him to someone who's got a lot of cap space and a big fat contract ready for him. And in that case, you've got a Ravens team that's a playoff caliber team that needs a quarterback and a GM who his legacy is set. They don't have to worry about it. And so signing Geno to a 3-year, $90 million deal is not going to cost him his career like it would for most other GMs. And so that's a situation where we might want to watch what happens with Lamar Jackson, because Geno ends up having a market at that point, and Seattle would have to look elsewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Seattle also has some draft capital as well to play around with. In a situation like that, obviously you're going to toss some picks their way. It could be 2 firsts.
I wasn't thinking Lamar Jackson to Seattle. I was thinking Lamar Jackson to anywhere.
Yeah. Well, he could come to Seattle too. He's
True.
my first quarterback to talk about in the trade market discussion. Before we get heavily into that though, let's just talk about a couple of things going on in the NFL really quick, and then we can
let's do that.
quickly move on. Broncos agreed to deal with the Saints to hire Sean Payton as the head coach. Sean was under contract with the Saints. They needed compensation to let him get out of that contract. They reached an agreement with the Broncos. The Broncos gave up a 2023 first round pick and next year's second round pick for Sean Payton, and receiving the 2024 Saints third round pick back. So essentially, just like you said right before we hit record, in the last 2 years, the Broncos have given up 3 first round picks and 3 second round picks for Russell Wilson and Sean Payton. And we hope for them that it works out. That's the marriage that I think Russell Wilson was always interested in having, with Payton being his head coach. He really liked Drew, whatchamacallit? Sorry. Drew Brees, as a quarterback and as a mentor early in his career. And I think he's looking forward to that opportunity. I think he got the coach that he wanted there ultimately. But boy, Denver paid a price.
Yeah, I mean, they've given up 3 first round picks and 3 second round picks in the last 2 off seasons. That's a lot.
Plus players.
That's a lot of good players that aren't going to be on that roster because they don't have the draft cap for it. You were saying that they traded a first round pick this year, and
that came over to Denver with the Chubb trade to Miami.
Okay, so it's Miami, but Miami doesn't have a first round pick this year.
But it was a different pick. It was a different pick.
Oh, so they had a different one. Okay, yeah. I'm just looking through the thing, trying to figure out how this
rusher,
works. So.
Basically, Denver gave up their pass rusher and another 2 firsts and 2 seconds for Sean Payton and Russell Wilson. Yeah, it's interesting. I just, but they also gave up that Bradley Chubb cap too. He was going to get paid $20 some odd million to be an edge rusher, and they don't have to do that anymore. So it is what it is. I think that it makes Denver better. Obviously, Sean Payton comes with a nice resume. He's got some dark spots on it as well, but he's a winning coach. Took the Saints to, 10 out of 11 years he was with them, I think, to over 10 wins each season. Drew Brees, obviously, quarterback there, similar attributes to Russell Wilson in a lot of respects, but Drew was much better at getting the ball over the middle and screen passes and so forth. We'll see if that can translate to Russell Wilson. I think this is probably the best case scenario for Russ and for the Broncos moving forward to try to maximize Russ's value and playing style and so forth. So we'll see.
Yeah, so I would look at that and think, is he going to try and fit Russ into the Drew Brees offense? And if that's the case, Russ is going to struggle. Or did he build the Drew Brees offense around Drew Brees' skill set? That's why Brees was so successful. And now he's going to build an offense around Russell Wilson's skill set. I
think the latter.
I think the latter is much more likely, because you look at what he did when he had Taysom Hill and Jameis Winston, and he changed the offense because of his quarterback. And so I think that you're going to see an offense tailored around Wilson, and that's what they need.
That's really the only way forward. You can't just say, this is who I am, this is my offense, and it's anyway. I think it's going to work.
Not when you have an untradeable albatross salary weighting your team down if you can't make it work.
Well, and the other thing is that roster just isn't ready for Sean Payton. It just isn't. So the defense is great, but they just, they jettisoned their staff. They lost their defensive coordinator. I thought did a decent job. Now they're going to have to bring somebody in. I hear that the signing that the Dolphins had of Vic Fangio as their defensive coordinator is on the rocks right now.
It's falling apart.
And that Sean Payton is trying to get him to come back. That'll be interesting because, that would provide continuity to their defense, but their offense is the part that is really going to need to be addressed, and they don't have any draft capital.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting that the Seahawks, a year ago brought in all new defensive coaches to bring the Vic Fangio system to Seattle, when Vic Fangio is out there as a potential, employee, and they didn't go that route. And again, they had an off year defensively. They kind of had the too many cooks in the kitchen problem that we worried about. And that you could solve all of that by bringing in the architect of the Vic Fangio system to oversee everything. And they've chosen not to do that. So I find that very interesting.
I think that points to like a Pete Carroll situation where those two egos may not have gotten along. Okay. The other one in the division, former 49er defensive coordinator, now former DeMeco Ryans, accepted the head coaching position for the Texans on a 6-year deal. That's great for the Texans. I'm not sure it's great for him, but he gets an opportunity as a head coach to build a roster in the image that he wants. If he gets the same sort of deal that the Jets gave to Saleh, something like that, and he gets some 3 years. The last two coaches have just not had any time, any chance at all to build anything. Maybe this works, but he's going to need some time, and he needs a quarterback out of this draft.
He's a very good coach. Make no mistake of that. This is a guy that knows what he's doing. And if it's possible to be successful in Houston, he'll find a way to do it. So I think it's a good hire, honestly. But I agree with you. I don't know if I'd take that job if I'm, him, because that could cost you 10 years of your career, because you're going to fail there because of the organization, and then have to basically rebuild your value, and to get a second shot. And so I don't know. It's hard, but he also is in position to get his quarterback. And I think that's that's part of this idea, is that, they have the second overall pick. Chicago probably doesn't need a quarterback, although we'll talk a little bit about the possibility of that. And then you're going to have your pick of quarterbacks at the second overall pick. And
and he better hit a home run with that.
Yep. And so if he feels confident about one of the guys, that makes that job easy, and you can just figure out the rest of the roster from there. I am curious where San Francisco goes defensively, because to lose Robert Saleh and then to turn around and lose DeMeco Ryans, they now have a hole at the top of their defensive coaching staff. Their head coach is an offensive guru. He's one of the best in the entire NFL. But on the defensive side, it used to be, they had a couple of guys that were thought of as the brain trust and up and coming coaches and all of that. And now they're both gone.
Yeah. They've lost two defensive coordinators and an offensive coordinator in the last 3 seasons. That's what happens when you're at the top of your game. I'm sure they'll figure it out. I'm sure they will. Dave Canales, close to home. Dave Canales, quarterbacks coach of the Seattle Seahawks, is conducting his second interview for the Ravens offensive coordinator job, per Adam Schefter. That's good for him. I mean, it's a nice bump. I'm not completely familiar with Dave Canales as a coach, although he's been on the Seahawks staff a couple different times. And
God, it feels like he's been on the staff for decades.
it seems like it, yeah. So
But
good for him. He's out there. He's interviewing. I haven't heard any word on Sean Desai. Sean Desai went out and had two interviews with two different clubs for their defensive coordinator jobs, and haven't heard a word about how those went. So we'll see. Okay, so the conversation. Let's get back to where we were.
Yeah.
We know that Geno Smith has earned a raise this year. We just don't know how big that's going to be. We don't know if it's going to be with the Seahawks. I do know both camps are saying they, Geno wants to be back. John Schneider's out there saying, yeah, if we can get Geno back, that would be great. That's our first choice. And it would provide some continuity to the Seahawks as far as building the roster, not necessarily around him, but building the roster with the exception of the quarterback position, and allow him to kind of just move the team along while being able to evaluate the rest of the roster around him. He's a good quarterback. He's going to be able to make plays, put players in a position to be successful, especially as wide receivers, tight ends, etc. So I think it's good to have that, but at what cost? If it's too much, like you said, boom, we got to figure it out. We've got to go in another direction. We've got to be able to make that pivot here pretty quickly, because March 15th is the new league year, and free agency begins.
And they have to decide on the franchise tag.
Right.
Before that. It can be done significantly before that, but there's no reason to tag him until you absolutely have to. And so they have to make that decision. Is he worth the $32 million to give him the franchise tag, or do they risk losing him? I think they risk losing him if they get to that point.
They do, but you have to weigh all this out. Like I said, when you're talking about building a roster, if you have completely crap quarterback play, it doesn't make anything else easy. It makes your defense work harder. It builds resentment in the locker room. There's a whole host of factors there, so that may be worth a certain dollar figure to John Schneider to have Geno come back, even if it's slightly more than they want, and maybe they can spread that contract out over 2 or 3 years. It becomes palatable for at least being able to still do some things with the salary cap this year to improve the roster. We'll see how that goes. I'm not exactly sure right now which way it's going to go, but I wouldn't be shocked if they gave him more than maybe what we're thinking. I just have that. It's just in me. I don't know where it comes from, but I'm thinking 25 to 27 is probably the number that they're going to stick on. And I know that hurts. Hard. It's painful. It's hard. But if they can make that first year number like 15 and then massage the cap around and maybe get out of that contract in the third year, that might be something that they would consider based on where the rest of the roster is. I just don't know.
All right. So but this whole conversation is supposed to be about if Geno's gone, he signs with another team for a big contract. What does Seattle do? We mentioned Lamar Jackson as being a trade. I personally think they're not in the Lamar Jackson sweepstakes. He's going to cost too much. Both, if you're not willing to pay Geno, $25 million, are you willing to pay Lamar Jackson 50?
Well, it really depends. I mean, it depends on how you view quarterbacks, and where you think that particular quarterback could take your ball club. Now, could Lamar Jackson take them further than Geno Smith with the current roster?
Absolutely.
So you just have to weigh that out, and then that would though strangle your cap for a number of years.
Yes.
And you kind of be stuck churning kind of where you're at with the rest of the roster. So you got to make sure Lamar Jackson's going to elevate your win total plus 2 or 3 to make it worth your while. Because if it's not, you're going to be stuck in no man's land for a long time. Aaron Rodgers is another name out there, Keith. Green Bay is reported to want to be able to move on from Aaron Rodgers this offseason, which would dictate a trade. Yep. And so he's another guy that's out there. That contract is going to be something that you either inherit or extend. And that's something else as well.
That contract,
$45-50 million.
That contract is terrible to try and trade. They're going to end up eating so much dead cap room. And it's going to gut the rest of their roster in order just to get him moved. And this is a guy who's 40 and looked 40 this year.
Yeah. And it sounds like that franchise is ready to now move on.
Yeah.
And
So
go
I
through
don't
whatever they need to go through.
Yeah, Rodgers is not a guy. If I'm the Seahawks, Rodgers is not a guy I'm looking at, because I think his best days are long behind him, and that contract is just an albatross. It's terrible. I'm looking at in a different direction as far as if we're looking at the trade market. Dak Prescott maybe became available with his performance in the playoffs. That might be somewhere that I look. But more likely, I'm looking at Derek Carr, a guy who has been the guy in Vegas/Oakland for quite some time. And then suddenly, with the new coaching staff, he's on the way out and available. And so you might be able to get him for next to nothing. So
Yeah.
those are the couple guys that if the Seahawks wanted to trade for someone, I'd be looking in that direction.
Yeah. Interesting. That's, yeah. I think that Derek Carr is a possibility if Seattle was in a win now mode. We talked about Pete Carroll's timeline. We talked about the rest of the roster, their ability to build on what they have with draft picks this year. If they can't do it in free agency, that's what they would need to do. Derek Carr could be an option for them. I'm not ruling anything out at this point. We know that Geno Smith is an option. So why wouldn't other veteran quarterbacks be options if they thought they could improve the roster over what Geno Smith was bringing to the table? And we don't know exactly how they self-evaluated Geno. I know that the early play really hooked everybody in, but that fade down the stretch, maybe
all the it's the turnovers that really hurt.
Right. And it played into more of a historic average for him. Mm-hmm. And if it's going to be the historic average, Geno Smith that we see, and then you're paying him top 15 quarterback money, say it's 27, 28 million a year, when he has all those turnovers. See, you were eating those turnovers at $3.5-4 million a year salary this year, and you could accept that because the team was moving in a certain direction. Now you pay him that money. That's the 3-year deal. Geno's your guy. You're saying he's our quarterback for the future. We're going to go try to win the Super Bowl with him. And then he has those turnovers. That's not going to be a good look. That's what gets GMs fired.
Yeah,
it just is what it is. Okay. Derek Carr's out there. Trey Lance, I thought might be a possibility until Purdy hurt his elbow really bad and has to have surgery and won't start the season on the regular roster. Doesn't sound like.
Because he completely tore, so it's completely disconnected.
UCL.
The UCL in his elbow. So that means that's Tommy John surgery. If you follow baseball, that's
right.
It's a year. They're out a year in baseball. Now in football, it's not a year because it's a completely different throwing motion, and it doesn't put as much strain on it and all of that. They can rehab, be back in 6 to 8 months, which means technically he might be available early in the season.
Sure.
Yeah. But that means
but you've got a Super Bowl ready roster.
Yeah.
And you don't have a quarterback. You're going to have to make a move.
That's a big fat maybe as far as getting him back. And they've got Trey Lance, who they spent the house to get him 3 first-round picks in order to get him. He's going to come in to the season next year as the presumed starter with Brock Purdy healing. And then once Brock Purdy is healthy, well, then you figure out what you're going to do. But by then, you might be late enough in the season that you just roll with this season and worry about making that choice a year from now. But honestly, if Trey Lance ends up on the market, I'll be surprised at this point.
I would too. Yeah. He came off that market as soon as that injury happened. The other low level, take a chance on a guy trade situation that might happen or a cut is Zach Wilson with the Jets. Turned out terrible for him. He lost his confidence completely. He's a head case kind of a situation. You just don't know exactly what you're going to get. But if you've identified that he's salvageable, you might throw a late round pick their way and get the guy in your building and see what you've got. I'm not saying
more
Seattle
likely
will be able to count on that,
cut.
But it might be an upgrade from Drew Lock. I just don't know. And it could be a cut situation where you wait. And then he would be a regular free agent.
You wait for him to be cut. You bring him in on a minimum deal with the idea that, hey, if he comes in and earns a spot on the roster and pushes for playing time by being good when he's here, great. And if not, you cut him because he's cuttable. Now he's young. He was a second overall pick for a reason. There is significant talent there. But if you watched him play at all this season, he is not a guy that looked like an NFL quarterback.
That's
So
true. Yeah, they
I
were
wouldn't
going with White as a quarterback at some point, a journeyman third string guy over him and benching him and literally not suiting him. It was a bad situation for him. I know that they're planning on moving on. I just don't know how it's going to happen, whether it's cut or somebody. They hope somebody will flip a pick to him.
Yeah, but if anyone gives them more than a seventh, plus he's got that first round contract, which means he's making
early
like
first,
$6
too.
million.
He's making a little bit more than that. 8. I think it's 8.
Is it 8 next year?
Yeah.
I was looking at this year's numbers, but yeah. So, what? Who's paying? Who's giving them a draft pick and having him eat up $8 million of their salary cap?
It's not a bad figure for a backup quarterback. If you look at the backup quarterback market out there, the mid to high end backup quarterbacks are making $8 to $12 million. The starter caliber, now there's no starter that was making what Geno was making last year, $3.5 million. The mid tier starter quarterbacks, the 15th highest paid quarterback in the league, it's making $29 million. So I'm just saying it's relative. It's all relative out there. It's crazy, but it's true. Okay, let's talk about the free agent market, Keith, because this is exciting. We still have the draft thing to go too. So let's kind of breeze through this if we can. And basically, I'll start the free agent market with Geno Smith. Geno Smith, the free agent. He's our free agent. We know who he is. He's a known quantity. He's been in our building for 3 years. Pete loves him. They want to try to sign him. That's probably what's going to happen. We just don't know what the number is.
Yep.
But he could be their guy, and we don't know exactly where those talks are or whatever. But that could completely fall apart if it does.
Yeah. And this conversation also is based on if Geno's gone. So let's go ahead and
if Geno's gone, what's plan B?
Geno is the one that makes the most sense out of all of these by far. But let's move on. After that, the free agent market is a disaster. The one name that people will look at is Jimmy Garoppolo, a guy who will be a free agent. He's a year younger than Geno Smith,
but has been hurt his entire career.
Yeah, so people will talk about that because he can probably be had for backup quarterback money. There's not a lot else out there.
Tom Brady.
No,
yeah, Baker Mayfield.
Tom Brady's not coming to Seattle. Baker Mayfield is not an upgrade
No.
over Drew Lock. Drew Lock is a name that's out there, but they could probably have him for nothing because nobody is interested.
Yeah, I was definitely going to round this conversation out with Drew Lock because Seattle's had him in their building now for a year. They've seen him every day. His work ethic, his camaraderie with the guys, his support for Geno Smith in the starter role, how that transaction kind of happened, right at the end of training camp where Drew lost that opportunity and Geno took over. He thought he handled that pretty well. And then again, he knows the offense, etc. I do believe that they'll probably sign him back to be their number 2, but they might give him a contract that lets him know that he can compete as well. So we'll see how that goes. So I'm counting on kind of Drew Lock coming back in some capacity, but we'll see if the team elects to move on.
There is one other name that I would like to throw out there, and we'll see what happens with him, and that would be Daniel Jones.
Yeah,
he was drafted by the Giants. He's been their starting quarterback since he got drafted. He looks competent and good at times, and he looks terrible at times. Known for being more of a runner than a thrower, but he is only going to be 26, and he's young. He's had some crappy coaches in his career already, and maybe he's a guy that's salvageable. We talked about Zach Wilson. Daniel Jones looks much more salvageable as a prospect than Zach Wilson does at this point.
Another quarterback to look at maybe is like a Mason Rudolph, perennial backup guy, and with the Steelers. Here's the deal. Any of these guys that we've just talked about, Jacoby Briskett's another name, Teddy Bridgewater, Sam Darnold, they're all reclamation projects if you sign them. None of these guys move the needle. None of these guys say, okay, this is our quarterback. We're going to go in this direction. All of these guys are placeholder type guys that are just bridge quarterbacks. If any of these guys are signed, and if it's less than 20 or 18 or 15 or whatever per year, the Seahawks are drafting a quarterback, because there's no way you go into the season thinking that Jimmy Garoppolo or Baker Mayfield's going to get you any further than Geno did, probably less. And so I don't see the franchise moving in that direction. To me, it's Geno Smith, or you're trying to go hit a home run somewhere, because
it's Geno Smith, one of the trades we talked about, which is unlikely, or a draft pick. And I think the draft pick, if it's not going to be Geno, I think it's going to be a draft pick. And then they'll sign someone to be a backup / bridge.
But the problem with that, Keith, is that we picked number 5, and there's potentially 3 or 4 quarterbacks that could go in the top 5, and we may end up without a quarterback in that situation, because you could have Bryce Young go off the board, CJ Stroud go off the board, possibly Will Levis. I'm not saying Anthony Richardson, but his stock is rising, and he could be one of those guys that is kind of a dark horse to go in the top 5, at least in the top 10, or top 15. Anyway, we may miss the opportunity to pick the quarterback that we want in this draft. I think that's easily said, because of the teams that would be wanting a quarterback or willing to move up in this draft to get one.
Yeah, so I would look at if Chicago takes a quarterback, then Josh Fields is available, and the Seahawks could probably get Josh Fields for. How did I say Josh?
Justin.
They could get, they could get Fields for the second of their first round picks at the worst, maybe a second round pick. If Chicago's trying to move off of that and just reset the clock as far as their rookie quarterback contract goes.
I agree with that.
And so if Chicago was interested in doing that, okay, but then send us Fields and we'll be good. Houston will be drafting a quarterback. And from everything right now, it sounds like Bryce Young is the guy that they're focused on and they think is there. Arizona is not moving off of Kyler Murray. And they can't, just financially, they can't. They signed that contract is not movable. And Indianapolis is probably drafting a quarterback because they need one. Well, that puts Seattle, the next pick, as there to get the third quarterback.
Cardinals could potentially move out of that spot, is my worry. You come in, and then you have another team at 4 that would also want a quarterback, and then 3 quarterbacks would be gone.
So you have Atlanta that wants to move up from 8, or Carolina that wants to move up for 9, Tennessee that wants to move up for 11, the Jets from 13. They're going to have to pay the King's ransom to move to 4.
It's true.
Or Seattle goes, we only have to move up. You're only going to move down 1 spot. How about, or 2 spots? How about we give you significantly less, but you're only going to be down at 5, and then you can probably trade down again and still get whatever the Jets were going to pay you.
Right.
And do that way, and then
flip them flip them a second round pick or whatever to do it.
Yeah.
And make sure you get your guy. I mean, this is going to be so fascinating, Keith. This is so fascinating to me. Having the 5th pick, Denver's native pick, is so fascinating, especially with Chicago at the top, not needing a quarterback necessarily, but possibly.
And Arizona at 3, not needing a quarterback.
And then these trades. And then, of course, our defense needs the most improvement. Jalen Carter sitting there, maybe Anderson, one of the two. I mean, would you pounce on an opportunity like that when you really need a quarterback? That's the hard part about this equation, Keith, is that if we go into the draft needing a quarterback, that's not a great position to be in. And so especially as a starter in year 1 is frightening to me.
If Fields is the guy in Chicago, and they've made that clear before the draft by not trading him, they're going to go defense. They're going to go either Jalen Carter or Will Anderson at 1.
Yes, agreed.
And then
unless somebody just completely blows up.
Yeah. And which leaves them and Arizona both taking defensive players, and Seattle is Will Levis is sitting there for Seattle.
I'm just not sold on him, but okay. Let's for argument's sake today, let's say it's Will Levis.
Yeah.
It's
Sitting
possible.
there. He's sitting there at 5, and he's your future quarterback. I find it interesting that you're not sold on him, but you keep bringing up Anthony Richardson.
Yeah, I like Anthony Richardson as a prospect better than Will Levis now that I've looked at them both pretty substantially.
Will Levis is good. Anthony Richardson is not. So
that could be argued.
Now go look at his tape from the last 2 years. He took a team.
Will Levis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He took a team that a terrible team and made them look good, and then lost all of the talent around him and struggled. Will Levis this year was Justin Herbert in his last 2 years in Eugene with Oregon, where he had a terrible coaching staff and not a lot of talent around him. That all made him look bad, but he still was a first round pick. And now you see him play in the NFL and you're like, God, this guy is the real deal. Will Levis is that. He was great a year ago, and then he had an off. I don't want to say an off year. He looked less like
he had 2,400 yards, 21 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. He pressed too much. It's basically he tried to carry the team. Yeah. He didn't have the weapons. He tried to do too much.
He didn't have the weapons. They didn't have the running
46
game.
times.
They didn't have an offensive line.
Just as a comparison, the offensive quarterback for the Washington Huskies was sacked 6 times. I mean, it was not good. It was one of the worst offensive lines in college football. I agree with you on all accounts. I need to further analyze that. I'm just saying I really like the upside of Anthony Richardson after looking at him.
I really don't.
Yeah.
Because I've seen way too many wide open receivers and the ball doesn't even get to them, or it soars 10 yards over their head.
His throwing mechanics and accuracy need work.
His throwing,
that's the developmental part of the NFL, and that's why he needs to get into camp and figure it out and get good coaching.
Find me a quarterback prospect whose actual throwing motion needed work that it worked out. There has been one in the last 20 years.
When you go watch him throw, it's not necessarily a mechanical issue.
Oh, it's mechanical.
But it's a consistency issue.
It's mechanical. His mechanics are terrible.
His throwing motion itself is really good. And we'll get into the weeds on this a little bit, and that's okay. His throwing motion itself is okay, but his feet work are horrible. And so when you watch his footwork, he throws off his front foot quite a bit and off balance throws and weird angles and shit. But he's tremendously athletic. So he'll run, he's like 6'4", 225, 230, runs a 4.45 40. He's an amazing prospect physically. Dual threat quarterback, rare arm strength. He can throw big time. I mean, he makes big time throws, but
he does.
He gets himself into situations.
He misses easy throws when he's got no pressure and a wide open target, and he can't get the ball.
Yeah, I think that's more stereotypical. I think that's a stereotypical argument rather than really digging into film.
Actually, his film. That's the reason why I don't like him as a prospect, is because I saw way too much of that. If he could make the easy throws, then okay, draft him. He looks great. He's athletically everything you'd want. And if he could make the easy throws, but he is a more athletic Tim Tebow.
I agree with you. No, that's too far. But I agree with you on the consistency to execute the details of the game and reading coverages and throwing accurate passes is his worst attributes. There's no question, Keith. You're right.
So the more
he's got so much upside on everything else.
Are the things that make an NFL quarterback good.
He still does enough with accuracy, arm strength, getting throws all over the field, reading defense and so forth, that you take a chance on a prospect like this because he's so rare physically.
If the Seahawks go defense at 5 and they are sitting at 20, that's where you take a chance on Richardson.
I agree that it would be way better if he's available in our second pick in the first round. I agree.
Wasting of the 5th overall pick on him would be an absolute travesty. It's
I
an
don't know that it's a
absolute
waste.
travesty.
There's no guarantees in the NFL. There's no guarantees on any of these prospects. There's no guarantees on Stroud, on Bryce Young. Will Levis is going to be a good pro or anything. Half of all first round picks are busts. They just are. It's just the way it
True,
is.
but why do you go into picking one? Like, if you highly expect the player to bust, why would you draft him?
Here's my deal on this, and you and I can go back and forth, and
Yeah, we
I'm
can,
sure we will.
and we will.
I'm sure we will. But here's where my bottom line is: I trust the Seahawks front office and their draft guys and their talent evaluators and John Snyder and evaluating quarterbacks. I think John's brought up 3 or 4 different quarterbacks over the years that he's evaluated but hasn't picked. That leads me to believe that he kind of knows what he's talking about on quarterbacks.
It's Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, 2 guys that he would
So
have
if
traded Russell Wilson and
if Schneider
drafted,
say we drop back from 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 or whatever, and we drafted Anthony Richardson, and he came out and said, "This is our guy." We spent tons of time, blah 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 blah, and sold the fact that he believes in that this is the pick. I'm sold too, because I've seen enough where I can see how a guy like John Schneider and Pete Carroll would fall in love with a player like this. It reminds me of Carson Palmer a little bit, only more athletic and an ability to add that run element to the game.
Carson Palmer was way more accurate. He had the monster arm, but he was way more accurate with his passes.
Yeah. This guy's a 56% completion guy. He's not 65 or 70% like Bryce Young. He's just not. But that's why he needs a year. He needs a year. So is Will Levis.
I don't agree with. I think Will Levis is a guy that can start year 1.
Will Levis is a 56% completion percentage guy. Had more interceptions than Anthony Richardson on less passes. What I'm saying is,
and
you got to look at this a little bit more.
He played in a conference where his team was arguably the worst team in the entire.
He played
conference.
in the SEC. There's no question. It's not great. But Florida, this guy wasn't surrounded by a lot of talent either. I'm just saying. So anyway, let's get back to the conversation. So at the top of the draft, we've got Will Levis currently ranked as the 3rd best quarterback in the NFL by most pundits. I've got him ranked 4th. I think Anthony Richardson, for me personally, is just a higher, just based on potential. And then CJ Stroud, obviously. I would personally, Bryce Young to me is like the epitome of everything you want in a quarterback except for size.
He's Russell Wilson.
Yeah, only less.
He's
about 20 pounds lighter.
Yeah, same height, about 20 pounds lighter, but everything else you want. He looks fantastic.
He does look fantastic.
Amazing.
He was amazing too in 2021. Way better even. He threw for 1,500 more yards, had 11 more touchdowns, and he was the Heisman winner.
Yeah, Bryce Young,
this guy's got it all. He does.
He's lighter than Russell Wilson, but he is everything you want in a quarterback except for height and weight. Yeah. To me, CJ Stroud's the guy.
Me too.
Because he is really
everything
close.
That Pete and John look for in a quarterback.
He is really close to Bryce Young in a lot of the intangible things. And then you add in the fact that he's 6'4", 220 and can run. And so maybe he's slightly lower on some of the intangible things that Bryce Young is so good at, but he removes all the question marks you might have with Bryce Young. He's, to me, the guy that if you're drafting a quarterback in this, if I'm Houston,
if I'm Seattle, I'm moving up in the draft for a guy like this. Now, if you think that you're one player away and you need a quarterback and this is a 10-year type deal for your franchise, flipping 2 firsts and a second and a future first to move up 4 spots in the draft to get the number 1 overall pick is nothing. If this is the guy that you really want.
If I'm Houston, I'm taking CJ Stroud with the 2nd overall pick, knowing that
I am too,
with the idea that Chicago's going defense. And I'm not trading that pick because I want CJ Stroud. I don't want Bryce Young. I don't want Will Levis. He's the guy. To me, he's the guy. Now,
Yeah.
people
If
are
you
gonna
were Seattle and Bryce Young fell to you at 5, would you take him?
yes.
I would too. I've come to that position after watching a lot of tape on Bryce Young, just the way that he manages the game. He's cerebral. He's impressive. The way that his patience works. He's got good arm strength.
He can get the ball out
It's not
really
elite, but
quick when
it's
he
good
needs
enough.
to.
Yeah.
I think that what you do if you draft Bryce Young 5th overall and you're Seattle, you turn around and you draft the best interior defensive lineman with the 20th pick.
Yeah.
And the reason is because you don't want him getting touched if you can avoid it, because he's not a big guy. He's a guy that if he is taking a bunch of hits, he'll get hurt. And I don't want that. So I'm going to invest in protecting Bryce Young. But I know that if I do, I'm getting a Pro Bowl caliber player. So I absolutely take Bryce Young if he's available at 5. I don't think he will. I actually think Houston's going to go Bryce Young at 2, and that's going to sit there, and you're going to look at Indianapolis and what they want to do. And do they want CJ Stroud or anything? I think that's becoming the hard part.
And you know that Arizona won't trade with us.
Yep, because they won't give Seattle a quarterback.
So they've got the 3rd, but they don't need a quarterback. So now you've got, Indy at 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're not going to trade if they're serious about drafting a quarterback, and they would probably take Bryce Young, which leaves us Will Levis or, Jalen Carter.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to be upset that we chose Will Levis in the draft and not Jalen Carter. And I may be one of those.
You're probably going to be one of those because I know how much you love Jalen Carter. And don't get me wrong, Jalen Carter is phenomenal.
Well, the only concern I have with Jalen Carter is work ethic. And if they can figure that out and they make that pick, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
But I think I would be talked into Will Levis, but I'm not exactly sure. Excuse me. If he's the guy that leads this franchise. I'm not. There's something there about Will Levis that's got me hanging a little bit, and I need to figure it out. And I haven't had enough time to yet.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if you do figure out what you don't like about him.
Well, because I was early on him. Well, you and I both were talking about Will Levis in October.
A year ago.
And,
yeah. Well, and actually, a year ago.
Right. And so I'm there with you. There's just something there this last season. I know about the limitations and the offensive line, the weapons and all that stuff. I just need to work through that a little bit more, and I haven't had a chance.
I still think if you go back and watch his tape, not from this last year, but the year before, and then you consider the coaching staff and the lack of weapons and all of that this year, you're looking at Justin Herbert.
Well, look at Will Levis too in this light. He ran an offense extremely similar to what Seattle runs.
Yes, he did.
And a pro style run oriented play action offense with shot plays. Mm-hmm. And that's what Pete Carroll likes to do. And that's what they do. And so the terminology and the fit, and if they want somebody out of this draft to come in and start for him right away or be pro ready, Will Levis is probably the quarterback.
Yeah, but CJ Stroud and Bryce Young could do it too.
I think so. I think that they can.
Straight up,
they haven't had to in college football. If you look at the way that they run those offenses, they're not quite diagnosing as much at the line and changing plays and going through a bunch of reads. It's not quite as much. Bryce
Young was for most of this season.
He's better at it than Stroud. Now, CJ Stroud, everyone's going to say, well, he comes from Ohio State. Nobody's ever, I don't listen to that part, but
Fields,
the going through the pro style offense, Stroud is going to have to work on that. But he's got all the tools.
What CJ Stroud's going to run into is the same thing that Fields is going to run into. When you go and watch his tape, his wide receivers were better than the cornerbacks on every play. His offensive line was better than the defensive lineman on the other team on every play. It's hard to evaluate a quarterback who doesn't get tested. He can throw a pass that it looks not accurate in a jump ball, and his guy just goes goes and gets it, and it's a big play, and everyone's screaming, and it's a touchdown, and you don't realize that in the pros that might be an intercepted pass. And it's not the thing that CJ Stroud can't do it. It's the same thing that I said when Fields came out. It wasn't that Fields can't do it or couldn't do it. It was that I don't know, because of the talent. He had so much talent around him. How much of his success was because of that talent, and how much of his success was because of his talent?
I think this conversation becomes really, really important if we don't sign Geno Smith.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If something happens, Geno goes away, we end up with Drew Lock and question marks. This draft conversation is just absolutely huge. It wouldn't shock me if Seattle moves up, because that they would have to. They would be in a no better position than Indianapolis at that point. And so
yeah, they would. I mean, if they could move up to 3, if Arizona was willing to do that, or if Houston is looking at the fact that that roster isn't a quarterback away, it's an absolute disaster at every position, and they
you
can
never
get
know
a bunch of extra picks.
You never know
Chicago.
what Houston's going to do in free agency. Now that they've got a quarterback, Jimmy Garoppolo might end up there.
That's true. If Jimmy Garoppolo ends up signing at Houston or Indianapolis or something like that, then if you're Seattle,
Geno Smith signing.
I think Garoppolo's probably more likely, but whatever. If one of those
Geno
teams,
Smith is in the same basic offense that Jimmy Garoppolo in, is if Geno can operate the entire playbook, and Jimmy's a little, shall we say, limited. D'Amico Ryans has been with Jimmy Garoppolo the whole time, but he's also played against Geno Smith, and you may want Geno Smith to be your quarterback. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. If either of those teams, if Houston or Indy gets one of the other quarterbacks, whether it be Garoppolo, maybe they trade for Lance, maybe they
get Aaron Rodgers, who knows?
Yeah, something like that. Although, why would Aaron Rodgers go to one of those teams when he could go when he's looking at, I want to go win a Super Bowl. But yeah, if one of those teams get a quarterback and you're Seattle, you're happy. You sit there and you wait, because that's gonna just about guarantee you a quarterback, and it's probably gonna be CJ Stroud at that point.
I don't know that it guarantees, because there's a lot of movement that happens up at the top of the draft, and so Seattle may have to move to get the quarterback that they want.
If you look at the last few years in the top 8, there hasn't been a lot of movement, because very few teams are willing to pay the price. Now the 49ers
it's very
did.
True, Keith. It's
the 49ers,
very true.
The 49ers did. They paid a lot to move up to 3 to get Trey Lance. But they also had to move a long way to do it, and they were desperate.
From 11.
Yeah. Whereas, and Seattle would be moving from 5, right? And so you kind of would look at that. In the top 5, there has been very little movement over the last few years, because the price is just too high. Now, if you are Vegas, or you are the Rams, or if you're Atlanta or Carolina and you solve your quarterback problem, and so that's 6, 7, 8, 9, that area. New Orleans, or not New Orleans, Philadelphia at 10 with New Orleans as pick. If you're in that range, people are absolutely gonna move up and trade with you if there's a player they want.
So while Seattle may like Levis because he ran kind of a Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan style NFL offense there, this one stat will make me tell you right now that Seattle will not draft Will Levis.
Okay.
Throughout his college career, he's had 25 interceptions and 17 fumbles. The end.
You're talking about a team.
Not good.
You're talking about a team that is probably going to invest in Geno Smith. Go look at his fumble numbers. They're worse.
Yeah, it was arguably worse this year.
Yeah.
So okay, so to round out this conversation, there's a couple other quarterbacks in the draft. Jaron Hall out of BYU, he's 25 years old, runs a run pass option zone read kind of a thing, kind of a discounted Kyler Murray type player, short, 6 foot 205, something like that.
He's also
Um,
old.
the other player I think Seattle might consider if he falls, and he will fall, compared to if he was healthy, would be Herndon Hooker out of Tennessee, the quarterback from Tennessee, 6'4", 218 pounds, vertical spread tempo offense. Doesn't really translate to the NFL unless you're Arizona. However, I think there's opportunity there.
I think that it translates better than people think, because if you look
Yeah,
at, well, Kyler Murray is, for that one, but Joe Burrow came out of a similar system in college, and no one is complaining about Joe Burrow and his translation into the pros, because he's been phenomenal the
this
last
is
2
a really
years.
clean looking player. So when you
It
go look
is.
at him play, he's footwork is clean. He's impressive with his movements and accuracy levels at all levels of the field. Had a great 2021 season. 2022 was all off to a great start as well before he got hurt. He had the ACL. He's going to be 24, I think, years old by the time training camp hits. But he's capable of driving the football in anywhere along the field. He's got a great arm strength. I understand that he's a very smart player, understands how to read offenses and schemes and so forth. And his physical ability creates a wide open playbook.
Yep.
And when healthy,
When
and
healthy.
so if you're signing Geno, but you want a guy in the third or fourth round that might be available that you could sit on for a year and come into your system, Herndon Hooker might be a name just remember a little bit. Because Seattle hasn't spent a lot of draft capital on quarterbacks, virtually none.
It's virtually none since
And
Russ.
and it wouldn't surprise me if they did sign Geno, that this would be a year that they would go out and get a guy that they like, whether it be Anthony Richardson, at 20, or Herndon Hooker in the third or fourth round, somebody like that, or McKee, the quarterback out of Stanford, had some accuracy issues and so forth, but he's more of a traditional pocket passer. They might not like that, but you know what I mean? Just a guy to have in camp that they've spent the third or fourth round pick on that they could develop that might be the guy.
If you're looking for a guy that might be Brock Purdy, late round pick, but has the look of a guy that could make that transition, Jake Haener, quarterback out of Fresno State, I believe, is a guy to keep an eye on.
And is he at the Senior Bowl this year? I think he's at the Senior Bowl.
I believe he is.
Yeah, we're going to have a show on the Senior Bowl, show after next. So at the end of this week, we're going to do a Senior Bowl preview. But yeah, I mean, there's some options out there. There's not a ton of great options if Seattle puts themselves in a position where quarterback's going to be really important, and it is. They're either going to sign Geno, or they're going to make a move, or they're going to draft a guy. I mean, they have no quarterbacks under contract in 2023. Something has to happen. And so fascinating for us, because everything that else that happens on the roster is dictated by this move. And so I would imagine this thing happens fairly quickly when it does. I mean, it's going to be boom, boom. All of a sudden there's an announcement. Seahawks do a pretty good job of not leaking pending signings and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see if this thing kind of gets done.
I could see the entertainment value of the Seahawks not having a quarterback on the roster for a longer period of time. Like they're waiting on Geno to make up his mind, and they don't have one. And it's like, we're starting to get into late March, early April, and they still don't have a quarterback. And just the entertainment value of the
anxiety.
The Seahawks are going, without a quarterback this year, and they're just, going to throw the ball directly to the wide receivers from the center, or whatever the joke ends up being at the time. It will be entertaining. It won't be real, and they're going to solve this problem at some point, but it will be entertaining. I'll give
What
you
if
that.
we go into the draft with only Drew Lock signed onto the roster?
Then you're drafting quarterback with that 5th pick.
Yeah, or moving up.
Or you have some belief that A guy like Richardson is going to be sitting there at 20.
Yeah, interesting. It's fascinating. I mean, there's just a number of different ways you can go. Our next show happens to be a roster building show, and we kind of talk about the philosophy of how you build the roster, what you build around. Obviously, quarterback is a position that you would do that around, but there are also other positions and things and philosophies on how you build things correctly and managing salary cap and all that stuff. So we'll get into that conversation too. This is fun stuff. I love this time of the year. This speculation stuff, this what if conversation is great. I wish I would go back and save some of these. Well, I do save these conversations, but go back and look and see how definite we were on our positions, and then have those completely blown up. It happens to both of us over time.
The certainty that especially me had about how bad Geno Smith was going to fail is absolutely entertaining. And if you're listening to this now, feel free to go back and listen to that.
Yeah.
It's
go back to the conversations in July.
Yeah, it
for
was
example,
an amazingly terrible take on my part, as Geno came out and overperformed every possible expectation in this last year. It just goes to
blew
show
us
you,
away, blew everyone.
John Snyder and Pete Carroll know more than you and I, Bill. It just happens to be
So there is an advantage of being in the building every day and coaching these guys for a number of years. Yeah, it's crazy, especially at the quarterback spot. That's a really interesting spot. You've got to have the physical tools, but beyond that, there's so much more to the position that you just can't see by listening to press conferences and watching people, get second team reps, in camp over 3 years, and then you never see the guy again. You kind of forget about those. Anyway, enough of this show. Let's get out of here. You can find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NWC Hawk. The show is at Hawks Playbook. And find us on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube, and hit that subscribe button. We'll continue these conversations. I promise. By the time the draft ends, you will wish that all these things would just end, and we would just have our players, and we'll talk about those guys too.
When the draft ends, all these conversations will end, because rather than arguing about what they should do, we'll just be able to talk about what they did, and that is usually better, because I don't know, it's just easier. But
this part's the fun part, though.
It is. So. It's a blast. So
all right, we'll see you next time. Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NWCHawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.